Hey, welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather, and I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, making it the original Tudor History Podcast. This channel is where I put all of my episodes from all of my shows, as well as lots of extra content like this. It's Monday, which means that Wolf Hall was on yesterday in the UK, and I am here with another reaction video. We're on episode 4, and there's a lot. Let me pull up my notes. I've got notes here. There's a couple of main things I want to talk about. Mainly Cromwell's illegitimate daughter. Did he have an illegitimate daughter? Also, the death of Jane Seymour. We saw the Queen die. The Pole family. We've talked a lot about the Pole family on this channel and in my podcasts in the last year or so. And Henry debating John Lambert and all of the things that were going on with the Reformation and the disillusion at that time. So those are kind of the 4 main things. Also, we see a note about Mary's expenditures for gambling and things like that, which I think is quite fun because it shows a different side of Mary than we normally get with the whole like Bloody Mary thing. But she did, in fact, love to gamble. She loved living a luxurious life of a princess. She loved buying gifts for the people she was close to, including Princess Elizabeth. So we will get into all of that and more. But first, if you want more Tudor history in your YouTube feed, why not go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a video that I put out? All right, so this episode opened up with the death of Jane Seymour well, I guess it opened up with the birth of Edward, the prince, future Edward VI. And then we saw Jane Seymour dying. Now, there's a lot of debate about what Jane Seymour died of. A lot of people say it was childbed fever. But recently, in the past 10 years or so, that's been rethought. Alison Weir, who, of course, has published a ton of history books on the Six Wives and came out with a historical fiction series on the Six Wives starting about 8-9 years ago. Her book on Jane Seymour had a different theory, and I had actually interviewed her about that when that book came out. So we're going to talk about that theory. So the first thing is death in childbirth in childbirth was extremely common, and even being a queen wasn't going to necessarily save you from that. Henry's mother died in childbirth. Elizabeth of York died giving birth to a daughter on her 37th birthday, no less. When Henry was only about 10 years old or so, and really affected him, made it a huge. He was very, very close to his mother, so she died in childbirth. And then 2 of Henry's queens died in childbirth. Jane died giving birth to Henry's child. And then later, Catherine Parr would die after Henry died when she gave birth to her child with Thomas Seymour, Mary Seymour. So she died in childbirth. So it's 1/3 of Henry's wives died that way. So it's incredibly, incredibly common. They would say men died in war, women died in childbirth. And that's just how that went. So as someone who had a very difficult labor myself, I'm very, very grateful for modern medicine. In the TV show The Tudors, when that came out, that episode, they showed her having a hard, hard labor. And I think at one point somebody even said to Henry that he was going to have to choose between the mother and the child. And so traditional kind of thought around Jane's death has been that it was a hard labor and she just never recovered from it. But looking at the documents again and the evidence, on the day of the christening, Jane was actually up. She was she was signing the birth announcements. She was sitting up in bed. She seemed to be recovered. And then she got sick with gastro issues, which doesn't kind of fit the narrative of a hard labor that just she never was able to recover from, right? So I thought it was interesting in Wolf Hall, Thomas Cromwell made this comment as he was going in and Jane was coming out, Jane Parker, Jane Rochford was coming out, and he said, she shouldn't be eating this heavy food. And they responded, well, this is women's business. You don't know anything of it. Stop giving us orders. And that is apparently how it went, that she was eating heavy foods. And so apparently she was eating quite heavy food. And The theory is that she got really bad food poisoning and maybe her immune system was lower given what she had already been through. But the notes and the reports talk about her having really bad GI issues. She was running to the toilet, she was throwing up. It's really not a good time. And so the theory is it might have actually been food poisoning that killed Jane. So I will link to that interview that I did with Alison Weir. She did a ton of research on it, talked to a lot of doctors, labor and delivery doctors about the symptoms, and people seem to agree on re-examination. It didn't look so much like childbed fever, where a lot of things can happen. Childbed fever is like a big term that encompasses things from maybe the placenta not coming out or getting an infection. Of course, especially with a long labor, your uterus is open, you're exposed to infection for a long time. And so that can set in. There's a number of different things that childbed fever can mean, but it seems like she might have been recovered. And again, on the day of the christening, she was signing the birth announcements. She was sitting up in bed. She seemed to be well. Nobody was commenting on how sick she was, which is a little different than how they portrayed it in Wolf Hall because she was already sick that day and he was talking about how she shouldn't eat that rich food. But the new kind of theory is that maybe it was simply food poisoning. I don't know, but I will link to the interview with Alison Weir, and you can listen to that yourself and see what you think. So that was that first part. And it shows Henry being distraught. He was distraught. He always thought of Jane as his true queen. He was buried with Jane. She was always the one that showed up in the portraits. Oh, and the portrait, it opens up actually with that Holbein portrait. And I think that's really interesting. I did a series, and I do hear sometimes the portraits and propaganda. That portrait of Henry facing full on was so unique. I can't even stress to you how unique that was. When you look at portraits from this time, it's always like the side, right? And it might be three quarters where you see a little bit of the person's eye, but it's never the person just looking right at you, which is what Henry did in that portrait. And there was talk at the time about people would go into Whitehall and they would see this life-size portrait of Henry looking at them. And they would think it was really him and they would fall down and bow to it. And, it was truly a piece of propaganda for the ages. It was amazing. And so that Holbein portrait that they showed in the beginning of that was really a big deal when it came out. So I'm glad they included that because it was so special. So I'll find also that portraits and propaganda episode that I did too and link to that. The Tudors were absolute masters with propaganda, especially then it continued on with Elizabeth and the way she just controlled her image so well. Ad people today could learn so much from how the Tudors managed their image, and Henry got that started with this Holbein portrait of him standing tall, life size, hips out, face out, shoulders back, just, yeah, I'm the king, take me on, right? He portrayed wealth, he portrayed power. It was a big deal when that came out. So, yeah, I'm glad they opened with that too. The Pole family and these Plantagenet cousins that are out, what's the deal with them? So, I've also, like I said, done a lot of episodes on these families, and I'll link to them too if you want to dig deeper. But these are people who are descended from the old Yorkist line. So, of course, Henry comes from this Tudor line that had been Welsh. They were probably Welsh princes, but Owen Tudor was a squire in the household of Catherine of Valois after her husband died. She's the Dowager Queen. She has this secret marriage with Owen Tudor. It was for love. It was very beautiful, very romantic. And that's where the Tudor line comes from. So they are the children of a dowager queen. They're the half siblings of the Lancastrian king. They were legitimized. Henry VI brought them up and raised them up. And the one thing that he did was give Edmund Tudor, his half brother, the right to marry Lady Margaret Beaufort. Lady Margaret Beaufort is also an heiress who comes from a Lancastrian line. And so that's where the Tudors come from. But they certainly were not ancient noble blood or anything like that. And the Plantagenets had ruled England for, 200 years before the Tudors, right? So the Plantagenets see themselves as this very ancient line, And there are still cousins floating around, and the Pole family is part of that, as is the Courtenay family. They are also Catholics, so they stayed true in the old faith. They didn't convert to Catholicism. So they've got kind of beef with Henry on two fronts. They've got beef with Henry on the fact that they disagree on religion. And also, yeah, they kind of do see the Tudors as upstart. And of course, we look back now at the Tudors and see this family that was this very successful dynasty, especially when you get to Elizabeth. But at this time, it still has only been around for not even 60 years. Two kings, one doesn't even have a proper heir, and is doing all of this to the church and destroying the church. So you can kind of see the perspective of these Plantagenet cousins who are floating around. The Pole family comes from Margaret Pole, who was the daughter of the Duke of Clarence. That name might be familiar to you. The Duke of Clarence was the brother of Edward IV. So there were these three sons of York: Edward, Richard, and George, Duke of Clarence. George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for treason. You might have heard this story. They say he chose his execution, his manner of execution. He said he wanted to be drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. So Margaret is his daughter. He had a son as well who was executed. Henry VII had executed him. And they say that that was something that had to be done in order for Catherine of Aragon. So this is going way back when Catherine of Aragon was going to come to England to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, the son of Henry VII. The Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain were worried because they knew that this other son was in the Tower, was related, was the nephew of the Queen, Elizabeth of York. I get all confused with genealogy, right? But there were the three sons, Richard, George, and Edward. Edward had been the king, then Richard became the king, Richard III. And so then there was this George who had been executed. And so his son, Edward, was in the Tower, was kept there for protection. And apparently one of the stipulations that Ferdinand and Isabella had before they sent Catherine of Aragon to marry Arthur was that they didn't want any other pretenders to potentially cause a riot. Or England had just been through all of this civil war. Ferdinand and Isabella were like, we're not sending our daughter, this princess, to this country if there's somebody else who has a claim to the throne and could cause trouble, and she could potentially get caught up in that. And so the story is that apparently he was killed because of Catherine coming. So that was the son of George, Duke of Clarence. But then we have the daughter, and that's Margaret Pole, and then her children that come from that. So Reginald Pole was a cardinal. Henry had actually paid for his education, had paid to send him to Rome to study. And he spoke out a lot against Henry leaving Catherine. It became a big thing because he wrote a pamphlet against it. So here he is, related to the king. The king paid for his education. He's safe in Rome. I've done some videos on him. I don't have a lot of respect for him. And it's largely because he's safe in Rome and on the continent doing all of this stuff, writing all of this seditious stuff against his king. Meanwhile, his family is in England and they're having to deal with the consequences. And it ended quite badly for them all. And Margaret Pole was executed. Gosh, she was close to 70 years old. And she fought it. She apparently tried to run from the axemen. The woman's a princess and, related to royalty. And so it ended very badly for the Pole family. So that's who they're talking about, these Plantagenet cousins who are out there. I don't know how much they were actively plotting against him. There were a number of potential rebellions. I don't know how much all of the different family members were involved, but certainly the entire family suffered for the acts of a couple of members. And Reginald, he never suffered. He was brought back under Mary. When Mary was queen, she brought Reginald Pole back, and he was fine. He was fine out of the whole thing. And his family were all executed. There was even talk for some time about Mary potentially marrying one of this family because they were Catholics as well. So that might have been a potential match for her too. But of course that never happened. So that's who this Pole family is. That's who they're talking about when, of course, if France and Spain would have had an alliance, they were worried about then their rising up, these rebellions from this family of these ancient royal blood, these Plantagenet cousins who have, consider themselves much higher than any Tudor. Their family ruled for 200 years. And now this upstart Tudor family that comes from a squire and the illegitimate line of John of Gaunt is where the Beaufort line comes from. How could that compete with the Plantagenets? And so certainly they probably were very much disaffected and were not fans of Henry. Henry was not fans of them, and they certainly did not help their situation. Reginald Pole certainly did not help the situation by writing all of this stuff and leaving his family to deal with the fallout. I'm not a fan of him for that, but I I think I did a video a couple of years ago called Was Reginald Pole the worst son ever? If you're going to write this stuff, at least go back and stand up for it yourself, right? Don't make your mom, your 70-year-old mom, deal with the fallout. I'm not a fan. Anyway, not to deny, maybe what he said was true, but I don't like how he handled it. All right, moving on. Yenica. Was Yenica real? So this Yenica, she showed up at the end of the last episode and she says she's Cromwell's daughter from his time in Antwerp, and he wants to bond with her and feels very bad that that he didn't know her when she was younger. So did Cromwell have an illegitimate daughter called Yenica? No, the short answer is he did not. However, he did have an illegitimate daughter. So a woman named Jane Cromwell was born in London around 1530. This was about the same time that Cromwell had lost his wife and his two daughters to the sweating sickness in London, so he was in mourning for that. So the records show that she was living with Gregory, Thomas Cromwell's son, for a while in his household, and Thomas Cromwell was paying for her upkeep. He was sending money for her clothing and for her food and her education and just her general upkeep. People don't know who for sure her mother was, but the historian Carolyn Angus has pointed out that a former servant of Cromwell's named Elizabeth Gregory was weirdly left a substantial sum of money in his will without any explanation. So that could be the mother, and she was a servant, and that wouldn't have been that unusual. So Jane married a William Huff, who was the son of one of Cromwell's servants in Cheshire, Richard Huff. Now, Richard Huff was apparently very upset about this marriage because he said that Jane's parentage was uncertain, and he didn't like his son marrying somebody from uncertain parentage. Which, given that he was a servant of Cromwell's, if everybody knew that Jane was Cromwell's child, then there wouldn't have been this issue around her uncertain parentage, which leads some historians to say that maybe she wasn't his daughter, maybe she was a niece or somebody else who had some relation. A niece would probably make sense. But then why was Cromwell paying for her upkeep? Why was she living with Gregory at Gregory's household? Why did this servant get such a large settlement or amount in Cromwell's will? There's evidence either way, right? It's one of those things that we probably will never know for sure. So Dermot McCullough, who has written one of the most recent definitive biographies of Cromwell, is confident in her parentage. Apparently, the 1580 Heraldic Visitation of Cheshire records Jane in the pedigree of the Huff as the based daughter of Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex. So people seem to think that she was the daughter of Cromwell. We'll never know for sure, but he probably had a daughter, Jane. Yenica is not real. And there you go. That's the short answer on that. Then I want to get to the final part, which shows Stephen Gardiner rising in prominence. Again, the Catholics are rising in prominence, and Henry having this show trial of John Lambert. Henry never became a Protestant. Henry was never somebody who believed the Protestant beliefs. He just didn't think the Pope should be in charge of him and say who he should marry, right? So Henry went back and forth depending on who was talking to him the most, depending on, kind of who he was getting his information from, what he believed. And he did have periods where the conservatives had more had more prominence and he was listening to them more. And then he had periods where the reformers were listening to him more. So certainly during the dissolution, he was listening to Cromwell and the reformers. And then it went back, the pendulum swung back towards the more Catholic beliefs. And he never, ever, ever wavered in his belief on transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the idea that during communion, the wine and the bread literally become the blood and body of Jesus. Henry never, never, never doubted this. And that is pretty much a core Protestant tenet, is that it's symbolic of Jesus. It's not actually real. But Henry always believed in the miracle of transubstantiation. And that was something that would get you executed if you didn't believe in that. So there was this weird period in the last, kind of decade of Henry's life where he was executing Protestants for being too Protestant and also Catholics for not giving him the power that he was due. So he didn't like full-on Catholics because they were loyal to the Pope instead of to him. And he certainly didn't like Protestants because he didn't like the way they believed in salvation by faith over works and things like that. And transubstantiation was a big deal. So this trial of John Lambert was basically a show trial. It happened in November of 1538. John Lambert was a very prominent Lutheran minister, and Henry did sit in judgment at John Lambert's trial at Whitehall, which was unusual, but he also was the head of the church. So, he certainly had a role to play with that if he wanted to. And he ordered Lambert to be tortured and then burned at the stake. Later, a year and a half later, in July of 1540, Henry staged trials and execution in the name of this new Church of England. 3 Protestants and 3 Roman Catholics were each tied and dragged through the streets of London. The Protestants were burned for heresy. The Catholics were drawn and quartered for treason. So Catholics were being arrested and sentenced for treason because they had a loyalty to the Pope, which was, they shouldn't. They should have a loyalty to the king. And then the Protestants were being sentenced for heresy. And Cromwell was one of the people who was executed under these heresy laws as well. So, of course, Anne of Cleves was Cromwell's big downfall. And I'm sure we'll see that in the upcoming episodes. But it was really for religion and for treason that he was executed. You couldn't execute him for Anne of Cleves, but they made a case that he was a heretic, and that is what he was ultimately executed as, was a heretic. And he did say, well, I don't want to talk about that until we see the execution. Never mind. I'm not going to talk about what Cromwell said before he was executed until we see it. All right, so we will leave it there. I think we have successfully covered Wolf Hall, episode 4, Mirror in the Light. What a beautiful show. I just love it. Do you have any questions? Was there anything that happened that I didn't talk about that you would like to see? Let me know. We will leave it there. Also, hey, just a reminder, Yuletide with the Tudors is going on. It started yesterday. It's a digital advent calendar. Every day opens up to a video by yours truly on some aspect of Tudor Advent Christmas celebrations. We go the whole way through the 12 days of Christmas. Yesterday was about the Roman celebrations at this time. Today was on the pagan celebrations. And then we're getting into how our Tudor friends would have celebrated the holiday season. So if you would like to add some festivity to your holiday season, why not check out Yuletide with the Tudors, englandcast.com, and then right up in the top right, there's a little button there that says Yuletide with the Tudors. So you can check that out. All right, my friend, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to keep binging on Tudor content, why not check out this interview with Alison Weir on Jane Seymour's death? Or here's a video that YouTube thinks you will enjoy. You are deeply loved. I am so glad I shared the planet with you. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to drink your water. Super important to stay hydrated. I will be back soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.